well-intentioned indeed, because we are competing with the ice cream in Chapel Quad. So your reward will be in heaven, or if you rush, you could go and get an ice cream as well, I hope. First of all, begin with an apology. They say don't ever apologize or explain yourself, and I'm going to have to do that in case you're expecting Liz Kendall and something awful has happened to her. But Liz Kendall, who is an honorary fellow here and is a mistress, I think, of Girton College in Cambridge, is not able to be here today to chair this session because of ill health. So you've got the also ran, or the super sub, perhaps. I shall be approaching Gareth Southgate to see if I can be of any help to him at the moment. Let me explain who we've got here today, in case you don't know. First of all, our first speaker will be Adrian Gregory, Professor Adrian Gregory, who's been here, I think, since 1997. He's written and is an expert in the First World War, and not least in that as a war of nations, but also of the influence of and the use and abuse of religion in those conflicts. He's also co-principal investigator of a major ARHC grant on global religion in the era of the early 20th century. Our next speaker, our next speaker will be Jake. Somebody swapped all the speakers around. Can't think why. But Jake is just finished here. He was saying he was sitting in this room. I'm spoiling your informal introduction. Sat in here at the beginning when he began as a master's student, hearing Adrian speak, and he has done both a master's degree and a doctorate here. Embarrassment time, and a bit of resentment time actually, that he's just finished his doctoral viva and it was passed without any corrections, not even minor corrections, which is unheard of, and so we'll have to reach beyond our resentment and envy to say congratulations. It's wonderful that he's also going straight away as a junior research fellow to King's London, which is where he was an undergraduate. So that's our second speaker. And our third speaker is Meryem, or Suzanne Meryem Rosita Kalayci. I can't say it, whatever, Meryem. Meryem is a colleague, obviously, in the history faculty, but more than that, as a chaplain. She's chaplain at St Hilda's College, and her interests include the voice or the silence of women in war and genocide, and she's a leading light in understanding and bringing scholarship to the Armenian Holocaust issues. So there we are. So without further ado, what we plan to do is that each speaker will speak for a certain amount of time, and I'll try to cough vigorously if they go over the limit, but we'll save questions right till the end, so that then we're not sort of running into other people's time. So Adrian.
Thank you. 110 years ago today, the world awoke to the news of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Just over a month later, 5 great empires were at war, and by the end of the year that rose to 6 with the entry of the Ottoman Empire. The First World War is conventionally described as a war of nationalisms or a war of empires, but was it also a war of religion? Not perhaps as we conventionally understand this idea in terms of the Crusades or Europe in the 16th century, but religion had a role to play in the unfolding of the events of the war, and resonances of the religious dimensions of the Great War continue to play a role in events 110 years later. It is worth initially considering the structures of global religion in 1914 in order to understand the significance of religion in that unfolding war. The first key element, I think, is the idea of established religion. The majority of empires in 1914, to a greater or lesser degree, had some form of formal establishment of a religion. So, of course, King George V was the supreme governor of the Church of England and separately head of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. both within the British Isles, where Ireland had no established church, and in the Empire, where the king, as Kaiser-i-Hind, was sometimes hailed as the ruler of the world's largest Muslim community, things were, to put it mildly, more complex. But the crown undoubtedly retained sacral status for many subjects. In the German Reich, the Kaiser Wilhelm was similarly the first bishop of the Prussian Evangelical Church, whilst the other states of the Reich had their own establishments in a system ultimately dating back to the 16th century. In Russia, the Romanovs had asserted their operational control of the Orthodox Church since the time of Peter the Great, and Tsar Nicholas II took his role as the divinely appointed autocrat extremely seriously. The König and Kaiser Franz Joseph was no longer the Holy Roman Emperor, but since 1870, the Catholic nature of the dual monarchy, the Habsburg Empire, had become increasingly important, both internally, where Catholicism actually linked together the majority of the subjects of the empire, although there are plenty of other religions which I will come to in a moment, but also diplomatically, with the Habsburg crown often operating in lockstep with the papacy. Amongst the first wave of empires to enter war, the outlier then was France, which, since the law of separation of church and state in 1904, passed in the aftermath of the Dreyfus affair, was an unusual case of being without an established religion. A position, of course, which it shared with a handful of republics, major and minor, in the Americas. The issue of religious establishment didn't end with this first wave of combatants who entered the war in July and August. The Ottoman Empire had at its head a Turkish sultan who was also generally acknowledged as the caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Muslims, and was acknowledged in many respects as a preeminent spiritual figure by many Shia as well. Although the Ottomans had formally held this title since 1517, it was really only in the late 19th century that they had attempted to give it any real political significance. Trading on its symbolic power, the more Ottoman real military and political power declined. So, the widespread existence of what might be described as sectarian hegemonies in these imperial systems curiously existed alongside a reality of religious heterogeneity across a lot of the planet in 1914. We tend to think of multi-faith societies as being a relatively recent phenomenon, a product of transcontinental emigration. But in fact, in, I think, possibly most parts of the world, in 1914, members of religious communities existed alongside each other on a local level. Now, religious diversity took many forms, from East Anglian villages with church and chapel factions, to urban centres in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where somewhere like Lemberg, today's Lviv, was divided between Russian Orthodox, Greek Catholic, Roman Catholic, and a Jewish population of various types with small numbers also of Protestants, or a city like Baghdad, which had Assyrian Christians, Shia and Sunni Muslims, and a Mizrahi Jewish community. Neither of these cities, in fact, had a clear majority. There is a plurality, but no clear religious majority in either of these places. Nominal religious unity, where you would expect most of the people around you to share the same faith, was actually much more of a feature of Latin America or parts of Western Europe. These, interestingly, of course, were also exactly the same places that were strongholds of anti-clerical republicanism. And so this nominal unity of everybody being Catholics, basically, in most of these places, is actually hiding some pretty fierce divisions between the church and the anti-clerical factions. But these, I think, are exceptional places in 1914. In most of the world, even at the level of villages, it was not uncommon for communities of believers to be aware of the religious others in their midst, and often, indeed, in some places, to share religious sites and holidays even, in various forms of local accommodations. The relationship between these sacral dynasties, these establishment religions, and this religious diversity, I think is worth pausing on. Monarchs and emperors who held some form of religious authority could, effectively as a gift, extend tolerance to those who deviated from that official religion. This status, which infamously, of course, is codified as dhimmi in the Ottoman lands, usually, and that's, you know, my wife, when I was trying this out, and I said, don't come over as an imperial nostalgic, and I'm really not. So this tolerance usually involved a real sense of hierarchy and superiority, inferiority. Was also very much conditioned on the idea of loyalty and deference to the hegemonic religion. And indeed, by the early 20th century, there were some serious signs that this relationship was breaking down in various places. So, for example, in the Tsarist regime's tolerance of pogroms against the Jewish community and the parallel intensification of anti-Armenian violence in the Ottoman Empire. I'll leave that one for Meryem. Okay, so that's the structures at the start of the war. Let me just check how I'm doing. Religious reactions to the outbreak of war. Now, with these establishment religions, unsurprisingly, bound by loyalty to their rulers, the fact that they endorsed the war shouldn't surprise us in the slightest. Indeed, in Christian theology, loyalty to the state had been baked in, really, since St. Augustine. Having said that, there was some qualification of religious endorsement in most countries, and indeed pre-war concerns about modernity and materialism resulted in many sermons at the outbreak of the war, which, although loyal to the crown, saw the war itself as a punishment of the sins of humanity and a call to repentance. The war in particular also caught the papacy in a difficult position, and the newly elected Pope, Benedict XV, had to consider the implications of a flock divided between the warring camps. And unsurprisingly, in this situation, he became a very early advocate of a compromise peace. The entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war saw an explicit formulation of religious war in the form of the Jihad Fatwa in November 1914. The Sheikh al-Islam in Constantinople ruled that the war against the Russian, British and French empires and the Serbian monarchy was a religious duty for the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, with the implication that death in war would make you a shaheed, a martyr. It also released Muslims subject to these powers from their duty of loyalty, inciting rebellion. Now, in practice, most Muslims in the Entente powers did not heed this call to revolt, in large part because of an effective counter-propaganda effort, which accused the Ottomans of acting, in effect, just as German puppets in this call to jihad. Notably, the prominent anti-imperialist Egyptian, actually he's Syrian, but he's living in Egypt, the Muslim thinker Rashid Rida, opposed the Ottoman jihad as an illegitimate jihad. And in India, many Muslim leaders argued that the Raj, having upheld the religious freedom of Muslims better than the Germans would, was a reason for loyalty to the British, and particularly after the British made a declaration that they would protect the safety of the Muslim holy places of Mecca and Medina. That said, jihad propaganda did have some influence amongst some Indians. For example, some of the soldiers who mutilated in Singapore in February 1915 clearly have been influenced by the jihad declaration, and there is also some resonance amongst exiles in Afghanistan. The question of loyalty, then, was prominent amongst many religious groups outside the establishment in 1914 and generally produced similar responses, which could be described as competitive loyalty. In Britain, for example, the nonconformists, who had often acted as the nucleus to opposition of the Boer War, generally lined up behind the government, to the extent that even the Society of Friends, the Quakers, was quite conspicuous in what could be called pacifist patriotism at the start of the war. In Germany, the so-called Burgfrieden unified Catholics and Protestants, as well as Catholic, socialists and conservatives. And in France, the Union Sacrée saw at least a de-escalation of church-republic hostilities and tensions. Old believers in Russia, Protestants in Hungary also made conspicuous statements of loyalty, and of course Jewish communities across Europe tried to compete in their levels of patriotism. So at this point, I want to switch my attention to echoes of 1914 in 2024 and look at two specific cases, one of them Russia-Ukraine and the other one the Gaza crisis. So, Russia-Ukraine. In 1914, just as in the 2020s, the Russian war effort was supported by the Russian Orthodox Church. But under the surface in 1914, there was in fact actually a good deal more ambivalence in 1914 about the Tsarist regime than we might think in retrospect. And a large part of this can be summed up in one word: Rasputin. Much of the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church in 1914 were highly suspicious and despised Rasputin, a feeling he reciprocated towards these bishops. And they feared, and probably rightly, his influence over the Tsar and Tsarina, both of whom, of course, were personally devout Orthodox Christians. They feared that Rasputin's influence was malign and to the disadvantage of the Church. The Russian Empire of 1914, like the Russian Federation today, also had an interest in presenting itself not as simply Orthodox, but as a multi-faith polity. And at the outbreak of war, it gets other groups to support. These groups, of course, particularly Jews in Russia, are motivated in part by the fear that they will be seen as insufficiently loyal. As for Ukraine, in 1914, it had been partitioned. In 1914, it was partitioned between Russia and Austria-Hungary as part of the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the end of the 18th century. In the Austrian part, Ruthenia, Greek Catholicism, which is a branch of Orthodoxy in liturgy, which is also loyal to the Pope, so this is kind of a compromise, was the major religious group. But there are also a lot of Russian Orthodox living in Galicia and in Ruthenia and Galicia. And in those areas, of course, the Russian Orthodox, naturally enough, when Austria-Hungary is at war with Russia, are seen as politically suspect. So the result was that the war in Galicia ends up being quite nasty towards a number of religious figures, with the Austrians detaining and actually, in some cases, killing Russian Orthodox priests who are seen as politically suspect. And then, of course, when the Russians invade, the reverse happening towards Greek Catholics. And, of course, both sides, although particularly the Russians, persecute the Jewish community in this area. The February Revolution, so the Revolution of February 1917, the initial overthrow of the Tsar, peculiarly is greeted by many in the Russian Orthodox Church as a moment of liberation. And indeed, the modern situation of the Orthodox Church in Russia, headed by a patriarch in Moscow, is actually a product of that revolution. Up until that point, the Orthodox Church had been very much more clearly and closely subordinated to the Tsarist monarchy. But of course, that liberation doesn't last very long. Because with the overthrow of the provisional government in the October Revolution and in the establishment of the Bolshevik state, the Orthodox Church finds itself in a very vulnerable position. The other consequence, of course, of the Russian Revolution is the creation in 1918 of an independent Ukraine. And this in turn leads to the creation of what's called the Ukrainian Autocephalous, I'm glad I got that out right, I think I did, Autocephalous Orthodox Church in 1919, which declares itself independent of the Moscow Patriarchate in 1921. So these people are still, as it were, liturgically Russian Orthodox, but now are loyal to a Kiev Patriarchate rather than to Moscow. Trust me, it all makes sense, and ask me questions if you want to know more. This church managed to survive in Ukraine until 1936, when it was suppressed by Stalin, and it carries on existing outside of the Soviet Union, in exile in North America, through to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The restoration of independence in 1990 sees the autocephalous church coming back to Ukraine alongside a new Orthodox Kievan Patriarchate, which is founded in 1992. And there's a long and detailed and overly complex history that I'm not even sure I understand, which brings these together in a new unified Ukrainian church in 2018, which was recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. While this is all going on with the Ukrainians, the Russian Orthodox Church accommodates itself to the communist regime and was heavily infiltrated by the KGB and its security service predecessors. So there is convincing evidence that the current Patriarch Kirill was an active KGB agent before the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is also widely believed to be crucial to his very close working relationship with Putin, also, of course, a KGB agent. From 2014 onwards, Kirill has claimed that the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church and the Greek Catholics are schismatics. And this rhetoric has been escalating since 2022. One result is that even a significant number of the Ukrainian church members who still see themselves as loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate in principle have rejected Kirill's leadership. So there's, in a sense, even within Ukraine, where there are still a lot of people who are Orthodox Moscow Russian Orthodox, they aren't necessarily now loyal to Russia. Kirill has also taken to claiming that the Russians killed in the war will be, quote, with God in his kingdom. In other words, is going to actually quite an extreme level of sanctifying the war dead of this war in a way that's arguably heretical by Christian standards. In areas of Ukraine under Russian occupation at the moment, nearly all other churches which are not Russian Orthodox and loyal to Moscow have been closed down. So Greek Catholic, Ukrainian Orthodox, and significantly also the growing number of Protestant evangelical churches. And that fact actually was used very effectively this year by the Ukrainians to appeal to the Speaker of the House and to get him to break the backlog of military support to Ukraine. Okay, right, quickly, the Gaza crisis. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 turned the Zionist aspiration for a state inside the Ottoman Empire into a new nation-building project. Both Zionism and the emergence of Palestinian nationalism, I think, have been seen primarily as secular projects, but actually, almost from the start, you can also see religious involvement in them. And whilst it's certainly true that a lot of Orthodox Jews, both in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, were either skeptical or outright opposed to Zionism before 1939, there was always some religious Zionism. Famously, perhaps, the case of Avram Kook, who is in some ways the founding father of modern religious Zionism. The emergence of religious Zionism as a powerful force really begins amongst settlers of the West Bank after 1967 with the creation of Gushing Uman, but it doesn't come from nowhere, and indeed Gushing Uman is founded by Avram Kook's son. Contemporary Israel sees a three-way split of the ultra-Orthodox between those who are settler-aligned religious Zionists like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, a somewhat larger group of ultra-Orthodox who have politically participated in all Israeli governments in return for religious concessions from the state, so groups like the National Religious Party and Shas, and a very small minority of anti-Zionist Orthodox, who I think tend to get coverage out of all proportion to their numbers. It's the middle group that's, of course, become very interesting. They have a red line in Israeli politics, which is the exemption of yeshiva students from military service, and they claim that study of the Torah is their service to the state, an arrangement which has been overturned this very week by Israel's Supreme Court, leading to mass protests. Now, these people are not protesting Israel's participation in wars. They're just saying that their young men have a higher duty, which is to study the Torah, and is the ultimate significance of the Israeli state. The hardline religious Zionists, as we are probably aware, have been pursuing maximalist goals of a purified and territorially expansive Jewish state, and they are unafraid of citing the bloodiest biblical precedents to do so. So, for example, the extermination of the Amalekites. On the other side, Hamas can also trace a lineage back to the early 20th century. The Salafist thinker Rashid Rida, who I've just mentioned, is a major inspiration, and his anguished response to the First World War as a nationalist bloodbath and of the folly of secular rule in the Ottoman Empire, compounded by the collapse of the Caliphate in the 1920s after the war and the infiltration of Zionist settlement. All of these things with Rashid Rida is one of the reasons he becomes a major inspiration to the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt by Hassan al-Banna in 1928. And in turn, the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza was the seedbed for the creation of Hamas under Israeli occupation in the 1980s. So the fusion of religious aspirations with nationalism, I think, can be seen as being apparent on both sides of the conflict. So conclusions. You'll be pleased to know, Andrew, as I'm probably hitting my time limit. In the aftermath of the First World War, the Carl Schmitt, who later became infamous as a Nazi jurist, wrote about political theology, arguing that the underpinning of modern politics were essentially religious ideas. The fall at the end of the First World War of dynastic empires of established religious hierarchy, in fact, allowed the latent capacity of ethnic, national and religious politics to emerge, some of which was initially, I think, hidden by the big totalitarian ideologies of fascism and communism, but which has re-emerged powerfully in the last few decades after the fall of the Soviet Union. And mergers of religion and nationalism, I think, have become apparent in many places, from the BJP in India to the magnification of evangelicals in the USA. But I think they're particularly apparent in these conflicts in the former USSR and the Middle East. Sorry, if I go over by a lot.
Thank you so much. Fantastic, fantastic presentation, breakneck space. So we're going to ask questions of him at the end, but now we turn to Jake, Dr. Gasson.
So over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to unpick the religious dimensions of the conflicts which raged across this region in 1914, the Balkans, and to look at how similar dynamics continue to influence the region today. Because while questions of religion and conflicts in the Balkans naturally conjure up images of the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, how the interrelationship between nationalism and religion drove conflict in the region in 1914 also has much contemporary resonance. So in 1914, religion cut across the borders of the Balkan states. Centuries of Ottoman rule before gaining independence had left behind an intermingled religious diversity across the region. Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims and Jews lived side by side in Macedonia, a region today within the Republic of North Macedonia and then Greece, and then previously within Greece and Serbia. The numbers of both Sephardic Jews and Muslims actually outnumbered the number of Orthodox Greeks in the city of Salonika, contemporary Thessaloniki, which had become part of Greece only 2 years before, in 1912. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph I, whose grandfather was the last Holy Roman Emperor, he ruled over not only more Muslims than Catholics, but a population that was almost half Orthodox. That's not supposed to happen. But the region was also in religious turmoil. The decline of the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century had seen religion emerge as a driver of interethnic conflict. Under the Ottomans, religion had actually grouped peoples of different cultures, languages and races. But the new states that emerged from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, such as Greece, Bulgaria and Serbia, they relied on religion to construct new national identities out of old imperial loyalties. The Christian Orthodox, for instance, became divided between the historic Patriarchate of Constantinople and a new autonomous Bulgarian exarchate founded in 1870 under the Ottoman authorities. Between 1904 and 1908, religion had combined with language to drive conflict in what's now become known as the Macedonian struggle, with Macedonia torn between those who ultimately identify with either Greece or Bulgaria, including the revolutionaries I'll put on screen on the right. But really it came to the fore in 1912, when the Balkan League of Serbia, Greece and Bulgaria and Montenegro attacked the Ottoman Empire at the start of the First Balkan War. And the conflict immediately became one of a holy war in the eyes of its belligerents. In the Bulgarian declaration of war, the Bulgarian Tsar, Tsar Ferdinand, spoke of a struggle of the cross against the crescent. The wartime letters of the Greek commander-in-chief, Prince Constantine, who had later become King Constantine I, were posthumously published under the chapter heading The Crusade, 1912 to 1913, and both sides employed religious imagery to mobilise their populations for war. Dreams of reconquering for Christendom the imperial city of Constantinople and the Hagia Sophia, the Byzantine cathedral built by the Emperor Justinian in the early 6th century AD, featured heavily in both Bulgarian and Greek propaganda. For Serbia, motivation centred on avenging defeat at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, which had entered legend for the martyr's death of the Serbian prince Lazar. And it's unsurprising, therefore, that the victorious advance of the Balkan League was accompanied by atrocities committed on a religious basis. Conventional forces, but more commonly irregular forces, subjected conquered regions to massacre and pillage, spurring Muslims to flee in search of safety. The report of the International Commission to inquire into the causes and conduct of the Balkan Wars, published in 1914 by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, recorded this violence in vivid detail. I want to sort of pick up two examples in particular to illustrate this point and give names to the violence. In one instance, Rani Effendi, an inhabitant of the town of Strumitsa, today in the Republic of North Macedonia, testified that Serbian and Bulgarian troops had killed between 3,000 and 4,000 Muslims in just 1 month. Another, Gustav Michel, a Catholic priest, described how in Kirkuk, today in Greece, the Bulgarians had burnt 600 men alive in the town's mosque while forcing the women to watch. And at the same time as waging a religious war in Macedonia and Thrace, the Bulgarian government also waged a campaign within its own borders, conducting forced Christianization against the Muslim Pomaks, a minority group who lived in the Rhodope Mountains. And the historian Fikret Adania has written recently that the two Balkan Wars, quote, strengthened the already rampant tendencies towards ethnic homogenization. On the eve of the First World War, this cycle of violence, forcible conversion and expulsion continued across the region, even after the August 1913 Treaty of Bucharest had officially brought the fighting to an end. Governments sought to create populations that aligned with the new territorial settlement, triggering mass flows of refugees. So from late 1913, the ethnic cleansing of Greeks in the Ottoman Empire and in Bulgaria spurred flows of refugees into Greece, who then sought their own revenge on the local Muslim population. In response, 15,000 Muslims fled their homes, including the relatives of Ataturk, the founder of the secular Turkish Republic. And those who arrived in Anatolia then took their own revenge on the region's Christian peasantry, who in turn fled. And even discussions of forced population transfers, organised on a religious basis of the sort which would later follow the First World War, also took place. Ottoman and Greek diplomats discussed exchanging the Muslims of Macedonia for the Greeks around Izmir, but these discussions were only interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War. And then when the Third Balkan War, as some have labelled the First World War, broke out on the 28th of July 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, a month after the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. So much as in the previous two Balkan Wars, religion became a force to mobilise across the region. In Austro-Hungarian Bosnia, the authorities sought to mobilise the Muslim soldiers under its rule and promoted Austria-Hungary and Germany as the natural allies of Muslims worldwide. So as we've heard, in November 1914, the Ottoman Caliph, the Ottoman Sultan, issues proclamation of jihad, and then within Bosnia, within the Entente, this raised the spectre of insurrection amongst the large Muslim population within and adjacent to the country's new border. So with Austro-Hungarian encouragement, the highest Islamic cleric in Bosnia issued a similar decree in December 1914, declaring that jihad legitimised Muslims fighting on behalf of the Habsburg monarchy. And then if we look back on the religious landscape of the Balkans in 1914, it is possible to discern several dynamics which remain of resonance 110 years later. I want to briefly pick out three of these. So first and foremost, the continued interrelationship between nationalism and religious identity because the splits between the differing national Orthodox churches, which were present in the Macedonian struggle of 1904 to 1908, actually still present, and they resurfaced again this year, because the Macedonian Orthodox Church, which unilaterally seceded from the Serbian Orthodox Church in 1967, remained officially schismatic until it was welcomed back into communion by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2022. But while the Serbian Orthodox Church has recognised its autonomy, the Patriarch of Constantinople still has not. And this difference in attitude reflects the broader struggle between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Moscow for religious control over the Eastern Orthodox Church, with the Serbian Orthodox Church unsurprisingly closer to Moscow. And issues also surround the church's name, as they do the name of the Republic of North Macedonia, because while the Macedonian public and the bishops want the church to retain its national naming, the only acceptable name for the Patriarch of Constantinople is the Ohrid Archbishopric. And then secondly, we had the continued interreligious tensions across the regions. So just this year in the Sandžak region of Serbia, where the population is majority Bosniak Muslim, but they're also Orthodox and Catholics, tensions surfaced surrounding religious festivals, because provocative celebrations in the largest city, Novi Pazar, amongst Orthodox Serbians for the Orthodox Christmas on the 7th of January, and then amongst Muslims on the end of Ramadan on the 9th of April, threatened interreligious harmony with their conduct designed to inflame the other populations. And then much as restoring the Byzantine cathedral of the Hagia Sophia to Christendom motivated Greek and Bulgarian forces in the Balkan Wars, the status of the Byzantine churches in Istanbul remains contentious. In 2020, the Turkish President Erdogan reopened the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, reversing the 1934 decision under the secular Turkish Republic to turn the building into a museum. But just last month, the decision to similarly reconvert the Kora Church on screen back into a mosque aroused condemnation from the Greek Foreign Ministry. And thirdly and finally, I want to raise the continued use of religious rhetoric and symbolism in political mobilisation, because religion remains one of the pillars of ethno-nationalism amongst violent right-wing extremists in the Western Balkans. In Serbia, the official narrative provided by the Serbian Orthodox Church provides the master narrative in which right-wing extremist organisations operate, such as anti-EU, anti-NATO, pro-Russian sentiments, along with promoting the unification of the Serbian peoples and praise for those guilty of committing war crimes during the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. In Bosnia, religious nationalism, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are all important tropes used by Serbian and Croat right-wing extremist groups, mainly football hooligans, whose links to nationalist political parties nevertheless remain unproven. So to conclude, the intricate interplay between religion and nationalism, which drove conflict across the Balkans in 1914, continues to resonate deeply in the region today. The religious diversity left behind by the Ottoman period and the subsequent process of nation-state formation have left an enduring legacy of intersecting inter-ethnic and inter-religious tensions. And understanding this historical relationship between religion and nationalism not only sheds light on the turbulent past of the Balkans, but also provides crucial insights into understanding the region's contemporary challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gasson. Fantastic. And now, finally, we're going to have Dr. Kalayci, and she's going, did I say that right? Ish. Meryem, who's going to give us our final talk. We'll have questions right at the end, so we don't lose your time. Okay, if you're interested in what she's going to be talking about, Armenian, within our chapel, you'll see that if you look eastward, i.e. liturgical towards the altar, not only that there is a statue of the Catholic tradition, there's an icon of the Orthodox tradition. On the left, there's a gift from the Armenian Orthodox community, which is about the Armenian genocide, and that was given to us in 2017, 2018.
Yes, so hello, I'm Meryem, one of the historians here. I'm also a historian of women's history at the faculty. Just a side note to why we have the icon in our chapel, why here and not at different college chapels. So we are the only college chapel who has received such an icon. The reason is, of course, because we also are the only college and actually the only place in the UK where you can study Armenian studies for a degree, because we have the wonderful Professor Theo van Lint, who is the chair of Armenian studies, the only one as such in the UK. My second title here at Pembroke is I'm also the co-director of the Oxford Centre for Armenian Genocide Research, and this is the context that I'm going to speak about a little bit today. Other than Adrian and Jake, I'm not going to give you a huge history lecture. I'm going to I think we got facts and context enough, and I think I want to reflect a little bit. I don't know if any of you in the audience have studied history here. Can you raise your hand? Yes. So I think, so we have 4, and I 5. I just want, I absolutely love my discipline, history, and there are 2 reasons for that, and one of the reasons is also going to lead us into my talk. The reason is because history creates doubt. It creates doubt around the language and the language that we are using, and I find that very useful. And history provides us context to understand not only the past but also our present lives better. I find that so wonderful, and I'm really passionate about doing that kind of education here at Pembroke, or also at schools around around the UK. And I think genocide education is very, very important in the current context. And I don't know if you were here during the previous talk, which was about using language and fake news, etc., etc. So I think it is really important for me to kind of, this is what I have come to say today. I think it's really important for us to know when to use the word genocide, and I want to provide you a little bit of context what genocide is, what genocide might not be, and reflect on when we use this word. So don't only look at the slide, but I mean, just this is based on the work of Gregory Stanton. These are the 10 steps to genocide, and I kind of want to hover in step 1 and then step 8, which is the persecution, and step 9, organized violence and killing. So as you can see, it's a bit of a sliding scale, right? We start with polarization, and that could happen either, like we have seen now in this context of the previous 2 talks. Religion is a very big way on, or a way that we see constantly in history repeated as a form of otherization. Because why? Because religion often is carried quite performative and visibly. In my context, religion, so my context is the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenian genocide. Religion was used as propaganda to make citizens that were considered citizens suddenly into others. And there's this really, really beautiful quote in Franz Werfel's book. I don't know if you have read it, 40 Days of Musa Da. It's a wonderful novel that describes the Armenian genocide, and the line is spoken by a notable from a city in the Ottoman Empire, and he says, "A second ago I was one of the most notable citizens, and now I'm kind of like a lump on the street. I'm no more a human being." And this is what happens in the Armenian genocide. This is what happens in genocide when people get polarized. Just to give you a little bit of even more context from the sources, I'm going to read parts of a letter that is available here at the Bodleian Library. So the Bodleian Library is one of the main places where we have sources on Armenian genocide, and one of the reasons behind that is that Lord Bryce, who put together the Blue Book about the Armenian genocide and presented it to Parliament in 1916, went into, so an Oxford scholar went to the Ottoman Empire to collect Armenian genocide witness reports, and one of the letters that he found recounts the following. The letter is from an Armenian woman who was able to escape the massacres, and she writes, this is 1916, "In haste, and in secret, I seize this opportunity of bringing to your ears the cry of agony, which goes out from the survivors of this terrible crisis through which we are passing at this moment. They're exterminating a nation, mowing it down. Perhaps this will be the last cry of Armenia that you will hear. We have no longer any fear of death. We see it close at hand, this death of a whole people. So I want to fast forward to remember these words, but this is the official genocide convention, as you can see in pink. This was decided upon in 1948 and then ratified in 1951. These are the 5 principles, 5 acts that constitute genocidal acts. So during genocide, not all of these need to be hit. One of them is enough. And I want to, so the first one is killing members of the group. The second one is causing serious or bodily and mental harm. C as the third one is inflicting on a group conditions of life that are calculated to bring about its physical destruction. The fourth one is imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group. And the sixth one is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In order to give you a little bit of historical context, I have chosen from my sources a source that kind of illuminates or illustrates what we mean by those different acts of genocide. So the first one is a really interesting one because we often hear that I mean, we know that the Turkish state until now is denying the genocide, but here's actually a source from the Ottoman newspaper, which was published in 1919 by an Ottoman provincial governor. You will see, if you're reading it a little bit while I'm talking, you will see that he is talking about killing other people. And he's not only explaining it with religion, but he also says, actually, there are economic reasons behind what is happening here. I'm moving on straight to the second one, which is a very interesting one, and it's often forgotten when we talk about the victims of genocide. We often talk about those who lost their lives, but of course there are those who have lost limbs or those who have quote-unquote lost their minds. Often women, in the case of the Armenian genocide, women were transferred to Turkish harems into sexual slavery, and once rescued, they were so insane that they could no longer really take part in a normal life. These two sources are from the Quaker archives. So Quakers, especially British Quakers, were very, very active in humanitarian efforts. You will notice that the letter is from 1931, talking about women that were just found in a governmental hospital. So the Armenian genocide happened in 1915, 1916, 1917. So if you're thinking about the women that are mentioned in this letter, then you can kind of imagine how long they have been in sexual slavery and have been constantly raped. So these are women who sometimes went through 6, 7, 8 different marriages or households, and they were sold again and again and again. I'm not going to comment too much on the girl. I think that the image speaks for itself. Here's a third one. So this is about the group conditions of life. You can see from the picture. This picture is from the Library of Congress. And there is a quote by an American humanitarian worker. So you can see how varied our sources are about documenting the Armenian genocide, and yet it is a genocide that is still denied. So I kind of want to underline this. And I'm going straight. You might have noticed that I have skipped one. Does anybody remember which one I might have skipped? It's the one that is called preventing birth within a group. And I was trying to find, I didn't know what the audience was, I was trying to find something that I could actually read aloud, but you can imagine what kind of actions are preventing birth. So this means often cutting open women's bodies, or removing the nipples from women in order for them not to be able to breastfeed their children. So these kind of measures are really, really difficult to put up on a big screen. So I jumped straight into this one, which is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, which of course we know from many, many different kind of contexts. And in this case, this is really interesting because this is also underlying some of the historical work we are doing here at Pembroke College and at the University of Oxford. So this is an online collection of survivor testimonies. I actually found this 10 years ago, this collection of 128 survivors 10 years ago on tapes, and with funding from the University of Oxford, we were able to make an online archive. So people all over the world now can listen to these testimonies, and I think this is some brilliant stuff that, that our university is funding. And this image was created, as you can see, by the illustrator Neva Diakanian, and this was created during one of our Access students. So sometimes I go to schools and I had them listen to Arvidi's testimony, and brought a school class of 12 teenage boys, brought them together with Nevat, and they created the image together. And you can see very beautifully that Arvidis is in the middle. He was dressed up as a girl in order for him to survive. And this gives you another information about the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide, in contrast to the Holocaust, was a gender genocide. So women were allowed to live. Hence, they often ended up in sexual slavery, or kids were often transferred into Muslim households and then grew up as Muslims. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we are doing here at Pembroke, but also the different sources that we have about the Armenian genocide. And I want to finish with this last slide. And I think this is really important, and this is really what I have come to say, because I think we hear genocide a lot as a word, and there's a reason why we are hearing genocide a lot recently. But here I also wanted to give you a little bit of a comparison what is what. Crimes against humanity is different, genocide is different, war crimes are different, right? And it's really important that we understand the difference of these different atrocities and international crimes. But just to conclude, I think one of the reasons why we are hearing genocide a lot, because it has a lot of currency. But I always tell my students, if one life is lost, that should be enough for us to speak up. It doesn't need to be, we don't need to call something genocide in order for these lives that are lost in that situation to be grievable. And we don't need the word genocide in order to create conditions that are livable for everyone, everywhere, at all times. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, all three speakers. And without taking extra time, but just incredibly skillful, meticulous, helpful, if dark epiphanies. So open to questions. I can't see if you... There's a reason I can't see anyway, but no one is. Okay. Can I just, while you're thinking of a question, he says, hopefully, share one of the things that is actually, the colleges in the 21st century, as Adrian pointed out, actually is nothing new about being multicultural, but we have lots of people of different faith groups, and particularly since October, the stresses and strains in the university have become very clear. One of the things that's been amazing has been the way in which we've brought together some Jewish and Muslim students and staff, and they've tried to support one another. And one of the things that one girl said to me, which echoed as I was hearing these lectures, was we're being forced to carry narratives that we don't want to carry and shouldn't carry. And then said, and sometimes our faith traditions not only help us to bear the unbearable, but actually help us to carry stuff which is damaging too. So it's not just, nothing wrong with just history, but it's actually current affairs as well. Any questions? Good.
Thank you. Obviously, as historians, one of the main things is looking backwards, and I wonder, in view of the you know, the intrinsically difficult topic that this is, whether it leaves you all feeling rather depressed for the future because, you know, you don't see a way forward, or whether you actually see things in history that leave you thinking that maybe we're not going to see repeats of things.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about this in a slightly different way, but yeah, there is hope, and actually Meryem's work sometimes where you look at humanitarian efforts, which are the other side of this coin, which is if you go to the First World War, you do see this extraordinary religiously motivated humanitarianism from the Society of Friends in relief efforts, both during and in the immediate aftermath of the war, or indeed Pope Benedict XV. I mean, you know, he's one of the good guys, really. I mean, he more or less bankrupts the Roman Catholic Church in giving aid to humanitarian organisations. So there is another story here as well, which is the way in which religion can be a force for mobilising human sympathy, and sometimes beyond religious boundaries. Again, you know, Benedict XV has two encyclicals in 1919, 1920, where he talks specifically about the new organisation which becomes Save the Children, and talks about Dorothy Buxton and the Eglantine Jebb, I mean, a Quaker and an Anglican, as these magnificent women who have founded this organisation. And you know, and this is at a time when technically, from a Roman Catholic point of view, these women are schismatics. You know, they're going to hell, and yet at the same time he's mentioning them with praise in a papal encyclical. And I think something like that can give you a bit of hope. Sometimes, you know, and again, even you know, figures like Cook and Rashid Rida, I mean, who you know, in some ways can be seen as being at the roots of some of the, you know, the militant things. But of course, actually, they were also rather horrified by the nationalism of the First World War, both of them, and saw it as actually a big problem. And you wonder if actually, if they were around today, whether they'd be a bit horrified at their progeny. So yeah, I mean, I think there might be a few things there. Jake, Meryem, or...
I think just to add what you were just saying, I think religion done really well. I mean, the essence of religion is really ethics, right? And ethics done well there is a difference between taking a position which is oppositional and taking a stance, right? And I think when religion is done well, as we have seen from humanitarian records, and I work on Quaker sources a lot, it's about taking a stance that something, a humanitarian crisis is happening, but it's not taking a position opposite towards somebody. And I think that's kind of what I have been, as a meta text from my readings of Quaker sources, what I've seen again and again and again, that we have to call out the harm that is being done, but we have to do it in a way that is rooted with...
and of course, you at the end of your talk basically quoted something that's both in the Talmud and I think the Hadith as well, which is, you know, who saves one life saves the world, which is still, I think, one of the most powerful messages of religion. So.
Thank you. A question over there?
Can I briefly ask a question from myself point of view before I hand over the mic, if that's okay? As a Balkan myself, and having had family members involved in the sort of the latter of the conflict, I was curious, and I asked this not necessarily having an opinion either way or kind of knowing where I stand exactly, but do you think sometimes there's a risk with this kind of academic work or museums all around this, that sometimes countries spend so much time looking backwards that they kind of drag themselves a little bit back in terms of then looking forward and trying to progress? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very big question to think about that one. Yes, I guess the thing ultimately is we are not prisoners of the past, and particularly thinking about it in a Balkan context, if we lean too much into that, then it contributes more to the essentialization of the Balkans as this inherently primitive, inherently divided, inherently violent region, whereas this in and of itself is a constructed concept. It's a constructed trope that comes out of Western imaginings of the region rather than necessarily reflecting the actual reality on the ground.
Thank you. It was a very riveting panel, very interesting. My question was around looking at sources, as you were saying, and I mean, within the Department of History, looking at some of the institutional memory or archives at some of the religious monasteries and other places which may also hold accounts for things which have happened outside of this accounts that are taken. One part of the question is, how are those treated in terms of sources, and are they sort of also incorporated as other sort of views that are being brought in? So that's one part of the question. And the second part would to do with the icons you were talking about in our chapel over here. You said it has a special place also for the Armenian Orthodox Church. So if you could elaborate a little bit just for us to understand more about that relationship. Thank you.
Kick off.
You're kicking off.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I mean, I was the PI on the project that was mentioned, which was on global religion in the era of the Great War, and I quickly realised that my linguistic and skills limitations were such that I couldn't take the whole thing on. So I had one colleague who was working on Islam, one who was working on Roman Catholicism, and spent a lot of time in the Vatican archives, another in collecting, the other was collecting a lot of material from Egypt. I spent quite a bit of time in the Lambeth Palace archives because Anglicanism is a global religion. You've got all sorts of interesting things going on there. If you want to catch me afterwards, I'll go into this. Yeah, I mean the archives are essential. That's what historians are about. And usually over time, what the archives are holding, what becomes important, and it might differ as new historical agendas come up. So I think you're always going in with this new idea of what it is that you're interested in, and suddenly a bit of the archive that nobody else has ever bothered to look at. So I found I'm spending a lot of time on the Mothers Union, which again, but again, it's a very global thing, and so it's absolutely fascinating things there. And yeah, I think one of the things about historians, and I think you both confirm on this, is it's that moment where you're actually connecting with the human story again. About the group of black South African women who write to the Mothers Union and say, we want to collect money, and we've collected this money and we'd like you to give it to someone whose husband has been killed at the Battle of Jutland. And there's this extraordinary empathy that's coming through from this, in this incredible sort of weird colonial situation where these black women are at the bottom of the hierarchy, and then they're asserting their humanity really by doing this. So yeah, I mean that would be one of my archival moments when I've been involved in this project. But I'll hand over to the other guys.
Jake? Yeah, what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's really important. I think that's how I started too with this moment of doubt, right? That we're always there to find more, and the deeper you go into the archives and the more into the human stories you go into, the more of yourself you find, and it's really interesting. I think the human moment is not just, we're not just saying this to make to make what we do more relevant, but actually there is a deep felt feeling in that you are connecting with the memorings that are standing beyond time. So I find that very beautiful. It's really extraordinary to have that happening. For me, the image that I showed of that young woman, I hadn't realized that disability is part of the Armenian genocide. I hadn't realized it until I saw the image, and I was like, wow. And I was actually quite ashamed of myself, having never knowing the Genocide Convention so well, having worked on it so much, having never connected those dots, because those are images that we haven't readily shared. About the Armenian icon. So this is just a short backstory. It's in 2015, at the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, the Armenian Patriarch in Yerevan decided to make all victims of the Armenian genocide, broadly speaking, into saints. So the icon that you're going to see there is basically the canonization, the moment of the canonization of Armenian victims in 2015. So basically we have around 2 million more saints now up in heaven since 2015.
We really need to
We need to draw things to a close, but before we do, I mean, this was an extraordinary example of how history and attentiveness and how that human connection of which Adrian spoke, of which all our speakers exhibited, actually shows that far from the world of sound bites and memes, we have the possibility of penetrating the mystery of our humanity. And so I want to thank you personally, but I think we all ought to thank our speakers. Thank you very much.
Very much like to thank Andrew as well for standing in at short notice. And I think if it's okay with you guys, shall we go and take a table outside on the lawn and be available for people to come up and ask us informal questions? So if anybody still has a question that I haven't been able to ask, please come and speak to us.